Jeroboam got exactly what he wanted. And that was when the trouble started, which sounds backwards. Usually people expect the problems before the victory, not after it. But Jeroboam had just received something most people spend their entire lives chasing: a kingdom, a throne, a future. Everything he had wanted, everything he had worked toward, everything that was supposed to solve his problems. Instead, it gave him a brand new one. Because getting what you want can be surprisingly stressful. It's like finally landing the dream job and spending the first week wondering when they're going to fire you. Or buying the house you've always wanted and immediately becoming convinced that every strange noise is a structural issue. Jeroboam had won. That should have been the end of the story. The northern tribes had accepted him as king. The kingdom had been divided. The throne was his. The crown was his. The authority was his. Peace of mind, missing. No one could find it. And the strange thing was that nothing was actually going wrong. There was no rebellion, no invasion, no army gathering on the horizon, no emergency meeting labeled "Kingdom in immediate danger." Things were surprisingly stable, which would have been comforting to most people. Jeroboam was not most people, because while everyone else was looking at what he had gained, Jeroboam was looking at what he might lose, and those are two very different ways to see the same situation. The kingdom was finally his, but instead of enjoying the victory, he kept imagining its ending. Every leader worries, every ruler plans ahead. That's normal. Jeroboam was moving into a different category. He wasn't reacting to a threat, he was reacting to the possibility of a threat. A hypothetical threat, a future threat, a threat that currently existed only inside his own imagination, which sounds harmless, until someone starts making decisions because of it. And this is the important part. The problem didn't start with the calves. The problem started when Jeroboam couldn't trust his own victory. That's where everything begins. Not with gold, not with idols, not with false worship, with fear, quiet fear, private fear. The kind of fear that sits in the background and keeps asking the same question. What if this doesn't last? And once that question moves in, it tends to invite friends. What if the people change their minds? What if someone else takes control? What if everything falls apart? What if? What if? What if? Meanwhile, life in the kingdom kept moving. Farmers farmed, merchants traded, families raised children, and absolutely nobody knew that their king was slowly arguing with imaginary future disasters. Jeroboam wasn't trying to destroy the kingdom. Quite the opposite. He wanted to protect it, keep it, secure it, hold on to it forever. And that is where the story becomes dangerous, because some people begin destroying the very thing they're trying to protect. And this is where the story stops being about idolatry, at least for now, because Jeroboam's greatest enemy wasn't an army, it wasn't another king, it wasn't a rebellion, it wasn't even Jerusalem. His greatest enemy was a fear he couldn't stop feeding, and before long, that fear was about to give him an idea that seemed smart, practical, strategic, maybe even brilliant. Unfortunately, some of history's worst decisions have sounded exactly like that, and this is where things start feeling awkward. Jeroboam had a kingdom, a throne, a crown, and a growing collection of worries that nobody else seemed to share. Because despite all his concerns, there was one small problem. Nothing was actually happening. No one was trying to overthrow him. No one was organizing a rebellion. No one was standing in the town square shouting, "You know who we should replace the king with?" The kingdom was functioning. The people were working. Life was moving along. But fear has an interesting habit. It doesn't need evidence to stay busy. It can create work for itself. And Jeroboam's fear was becoming extremely productive. There was one detail he couldn't stop thinking about: Jerusalem. The city was no longer part of his kingdom, but it was still important, very important, because that's where the temple was. And every year people traveled there to worship. The traditions were still there, the festivals were still there, the routines were still there. Nothing had changed, except one thing. Jeroboam was now looking at those traditions through the eyes of a nervous king. And nervous kings can turn ordinary situations into emergencies remarkably fast. In his mind, a dangerous possibility began to form. What if the people kept traveling to Jerusalem? What if they spent time there? What if they felt connected to the southern kingdom again? What if they decided they preferred the other king? What if they stopped supporting him? What if the kingdom slipped away? Notice how many of those sentences begin with "what if." That is rarely a good sign, especially when someone has power, because once enough what ifs pile up together, they start feeling like facts. Jeroboam wasn't responding to reality anymore. He was responding to predictions. Predictions about predictions, which is usually how perfectly manageable situations become very expensive mistakes. It's like installing security cameras, then adding more cameras, then adding alarms, then adding backup alarms, then staying awake all night watching the cameras. At some point, the problem is no longer security. The problem is the person watching the security feed. Jeroboam was reaching that stage. The danger wasn't real, not yet, but the fear was. And fear tends to demand action. It hates sitting still. It hates uncertainty. Most of all, it hates trusting. So Jeroboam began searching for a solution, not to an actual crisis, to a possible future crisis, a theoretical crisis, a crisis that currently existed only inside his own head. Unfortunately, solutions built for imaginary problems can become very real problems themselves, and that's exactly where Jeroboam was heading. Because the more he thought about Jerusalem, the more dangerous it seemed. The more dangerous it seemed, the more urgent the situation felt. And the more urgent the situation felt, the more convinced he became that something had to be done. Immediately. Preferably yesterday. The kingdom needed protection. At least that's what he told himself. The people needed an alternative. At least that's what he told himself. A new system had to be created. At least that's what he told himself. And that's how fear usually works. First it asks a question, then it provides an answer. Then it convinces a person that the answer was their idea all along. Jeroboam was getting very close to that final step, because after spending enough time worrying about losing the kingdom, he finally came up with a plan, and honestly, on paper it looked brilliant, which was exactly the problem. The 2 golden calves were a great idea, and that was exactly the problem. Because truly disastrous decisions rarely introduce themselves as disasters. They usually arrive wearing a name tag that says, "Practical Solution." After weeks of worrying about Jerusalem, Jeroboam finally had an answer. The people wanted places to worship. Fine. He would give them places to worship, close to home, convenient, accessible, no long journeys required, no annual trips south, no opportunities for divided loyalties. Problem solved. At least, that's how it looked. And honestly, a lot of people probably thought it sounded reasonable, which should have been a warning sign, because some of history's most expensive mistakes received overwhelming approval at the time. Jeroboam wasn't pacing around his palace planning to destroy a kingdom. He wasn't plotting rebellion. He wasn't trying to create chaos. Quite the opposite. He was trying to stabilize everything. That's what makes this story so dangerous. The intention wasn't the problem. The logic was. Jeroboam looked at a temporary concern and built a permanent solution, which is a little like renovating an entire house because one window won't close properly. Technically, something got fixed, several other things got broken, but those details usually arrive later. For now, the plan looked brilliant. The people would stay closer to home. The kingdom would feel more unified. The throne would feel more secure. Everyone wins, at least according to the presentation. If Jeroboam had held a staff meeting, the slides probably would have looked fantastic. Projected risk, future loyalty shifts, proposed solution, new worship centers, expected outcome, kingdom stability, confidence level extremely high, potential consequences to be discussed never. And so Jeroboam placed 1 golden calf in Bethel, another in Dan, 2 locations, 2 symbols, 2 solutions. Simple, efficient, dangerous. The strange thing is that most destructive systems don't look destructive when they're being built. They look useful, helpful, necessary, even responsible. Nobody stands up and announces, "Today, I will begin creating a problem that future generations will struggle to undo." That's not how these things happen. Instead, someone says, "This should help," Jeroboam genuinely believed he was helping the kingdom, helping the people, helping the future. The problem was that fear had quietly taken over the planning department, and fear is excellent at creating convincing arguments. It can make bad ideas sound responsible, shortcuts sound wise, control sound necessary, and temporary worries sound permanent. By this point, Jeroboam wasn't really solving a problem anymore. He was protecting himself from a fear that had slowly disguised itself as strategy. Which is why the calves matter, not because they appeared out of nowhere, but because they were the visible result of something invisible. Weeks of worry, months of suspicion, a growing inability to trust what he already had. The gold wasn't the beginning, it was the symptom. And symptoms have a habit of revealing problems that started much earlier. Unfortunately, once a leader builds a system, that system rarely stays small. People adapt to it, communities organize around it, new habits form, new expectations appear. What begins as a temporary answer slowly becomes normal. And Jeroboam had just built something that was about to become very normal, because a temporary fear had now created a permanent structure. And permanent structures tend to outlive the people who build them, which would become a very important detail later, because the kingdom wasn't simply living with Jeroboam's decision. Soon, it would inherit it. Jeroboam died. His mistake didn't, and that is usually where things become expensive. Because people eventually disappear, systems don't. A king rules for a few decades, a habit can rule for centuries. Jeroboam had built his solution. The worship centers remained, the new routines remained, the new expectations remained. And before long, something strange happened. People stopped seeing them as new. They simply became normal, which is how many long-term problems begin. Not with dramatic explosions, not with immediate disasters, but with repetition. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation. At first, everyone remembers who started it. Then fewer people remember. Then almost nobody remembers. Eventually, people assume it has always been there. And once something feels normal, it becomes surprisingly difficult to question. It's a little like creating a shortcut through a field. At first, it's just a path. Then more people use it. Then it becomes permanent. Then, years later, nobody remembers there was ever another route. Jeroboam's decision followed the same pattern. What began as a response to fear slowly became part of the kingdom's identity. New kings arrived. The system remained. Old rulers died. The system remained. Political alliances changed. The system remained. Wars came and went. The system remained. Which is impressive, and also deeply unfortunate, because the original problem Jeroboam was trying to solve was temporary. The solution wasn't. That tends to create complications. Imagine borrowing a ladder to fix a small leak, then deciding the ladder should become a permanent part of the house. At some point, the temporary tool stops being temporary. Jeroboam had done something similar. He had created a structure for a moment. The kingdom turned it into a culture, and cultures are much harder to remove than structures. You can tear down a building, you can replace a ruler, you can rewrite policies. Changing habits, that gets complicated, especially when those habits have had decades to settle in. The irony was impossible to miss. Jeroboam wanted stability. He ended up teaching instability. He wanted security. He created dependency. He wanted to protect the kingdom. He gave future generations a problem they would continue carrying long after he was gone. And the most remarkable part, the calves themselves were never really the center of the story. The real story was what they represented, a fearful decision. Repeated often enough to become normal, because some mistakes end the same day they begin. Others learn how to survive. They spread, they settle in, they become traditions, and traditions are powerful things. People defend them, protect them, pass them on, sometimes without ever asking where they came from or why they exist in the first place. That was now happening across the kingdom. A decision born from fear had become part of everyday life, not because everyone agreed with Jeroboam, not because everyone understood Jeroboam, but because enough time had passed, and time has a way of making unusual things feel ordinary. By now, The kingdom wasn't merely living with Jeroboam's mistake, it was being shaped by it. Which brings us to the most important part of the story. Because the title was never really about two golden calves, it was about what created them and what they eventually revealed. Because kingdoms rarely break all at once, usually they begin breaking much earlier. Long before anyone notices, Jeroboam didn't break the kingdom with two golden calves, at least not directly. That was the visible part. The real story started much earlier, long before the gold, long before the altars, long before the system. It started with a victory Jeroboam couldn't trust. And that's what makes this story so strange. Because most people expect kingdoms to collapse because of enemies, wars, invasions, rebellions, assassinations, the usual kingdom-related problems. Jeroboam's story followed a different path. He got what he wanted, then he became afraid of losing it. And from that point forward, every major decision began flowing through that fear. First came the victory, then came the worry, then came the need for control, then came the calves, then came the new system, then came decades of consequences. Step by step, decision by decision. Nothing looked catastrophic at the beginning. That's usually how these things work. The biggest disasters rarely arrive wearing signs that say, "Attention, disaster currently in progress." Instead, they arrive disguised as reasonable precautions, helpful adjustments, temporary solutions, practical ideas. Jeroboam never woke up and decided to destroy a kingdom. He woke up and decided to protect one. That was the irony. And it remained the irony all the way to the end. Because the calves were never really the problem. They were the result, the symptom, the visible evidence of something happening underneath. Fear. Not the kind of fear that screams, the kind that whispers, the kind that quietly asks, "What if this goes wrong?" Then asks it again, and again, and again, until eventually the question starts making decisions. Jeroboam wasn't defeated by another king. He wasn't defeated by an invading army. He wasn't defeated by a superior strategy. He was defeated by a fear that slowly convinced him it was wisdom. And that distinction matters. Because fear and wisdom can sometimes sound remarkably similar. Both talk about the future. Both discuss risks. Both encourage preparation. The difference is that wisdom sees reality. Fear sees possibilities and treats them like certainty. Jeroboam stopped trusting reality. He started trusting possibilities. And once that happened, the rest of the story became much easier to predict. The kingdom was his. It had already been given to him. But he spent so much time trying to prevent its loss that he ended up creating the very conditions that helped weaken it. Which is a lesson history seems determined to repeat. People fear losing relationships, then become controlling. People fear losing opportunities, then sabotage them. People fear losing success, then make decisions that quietly undermine it. The pattern changes, the mechanism doesn't. And that brings us back to the title. Jeroboam built two calves and broke a kingdom. Technically true, but incomplete, because the calves didn't break the kingdom by themselves. Fear broke it first. The calves simply gave that fear a shape, a structure, a system, something future generations could inherit. In the end, Jeroboam spent years trying to stop the kingdom from slipping away. And in doing so, he helped create exactly the thing he feared. Because Jeroboam didn't begin losing the kingdom when his enemies became stronger. He began losing it the moment he allowed fear to govern a victory that was already his.